Hello and welcome back to a new tutorial. This week we're going to be creating this trail effect in Cinema 4D. It's a simple one to follow along with, and like in many of my other tutorials we're going to be using the freeze field. So let's jump in and get started. So I'm just going to be breaking down my scene instead of building it all from scratch, but I'll try to explain it as clear as possible so it's easy for you to replicate. So I've got my scene here. This is what it's going to look like when you play it through. You can see it's actually creating the trail as if these spheres are actually pushing through the ground. So first thing you want to do is make sure you've got your object animated. So what I did first was animate these spheres just moving through this. So let's actually just turn off these effectors. So what I did, was just animate these spheres. They're just moving through the plane, and that's it. So once you've got that, once you've got your animation sorted, whether it's on your own models or whether you're going to try to replicate what I'm doing, you just need to make sure you've got an animation. And then once you've done that, you want to make sure we go to the first keyframe. You're going to want to drop a spherical field on top of your object, or depending what it could be a different type of field. I've just used spherical fields because obviously I'm using spheres. So depending on what your object you're using, you might want to use a different field or like a custom one. So the object that's actually going to be creating the trail is this plane effector here. So if I turn this back on, and let's just turn off. Let's ignore these ones for now. Let's just focus on one sphere. So what we're doing is, let me go inside the effector, and so in this parameter section, I've got position turned on and I've got -12 centimeters put in. So what happens is when I set up my fields, which you can see here, I've got a trail field which is linked to this sphere. I drop that in, and we'll ignore the freeze for a second, but wherever that spherical field is, you see it's going to be pushing down in that area. So whatever's been affected by this spherical field, let me select it. So you can see this one. So whenever any faces or points are within this area, they're going to be pushed down. So if I went into my plane and turn off this freeze actually for a second, if I hit play, you see you can't actually see the trail, but we go underneath. See, it's just constantly updating which points to be pushing down because the spherical field is parented to the sphere, which is also moving. So the way I got the trail to work was adding a freeze field below this, and then just make sure the first trail field is set to max. So that's this one that's you can see attached to the sphere. And then inside your freeze, you want to make sure you've got mode grow set. And we don't want any effect strength on this because we're just leaving a trail, so we don't want the trail to be growing. So like if I enable this, and then hit play, see we're leaving a trail now, but it's not looking too great right now, so we'll add some smoothing and stuff later. This freeze field is actually taking the information from our spherical field, and instead of it just updating and like reverting the old points back to where they were, it's keeping them where they've been set to. So it's a really powerful field. I use it in pretty much all my tutorials, so why not show more techniques on how to use it. If you did want to set it to grow, you could. So if I set this to 23, you can see it's just growing away from wherever it leaves, which is very cool. You can this is kind of how I set up my grass growing tutorial. But anyway, that's not what I want for this tutorial, so I'm just going to set this back to 0. So it's looking quite rough, so what I did was just drop in a smooth. Smoothing modifier, or enable that back on. So that's just smoothed everything out. It looks a lot better. But you can definitely play with the parameters inside here. I don't know. Oh yeah, so I've upped my iterations to 18. Stiffness is 36, and I don't think this matters too much. Yeah, I could leave that at 100. So that is kind of the effect already set up, like the trail is already working. I guess if you wanted now to add extra spheres, so I did kind of just make this first one and then copy these over, so you don't need to make all 3 right now, because I just made this one, set it up, and then duplicated it 2 more times and just changed how they animated. So I can turn these all back on, and you can see they've all got the exact same setup, but you just need to make sure that you drop them into your plane effector. So we go into fields, and you can see I've got these extra trails, and I've just set them to add. You need to make sure they are set to add, because if they're not, then it's only going to take into consideration the first one that we set up here. So you can see these ones are just being ignored. So make sure these are set to add. And now this will work. Now you can see I've added these extra fields here. These are just some interesting effects I was playing around with. They're not exactly for a trail, but I think sometimes they can resemble like water. If I play this, you can see how like they're kind of wobbling a bit. It kind of looks a bit liquidy. I don't know, it's kind of strange, but I thought that's just a cool thing to show off if you wanted to do something like that. Anyway, so that is the trail effect all set up. If you wanted to add some materials, maybe you wanted the material to change for the trail like I did in my example, you could set up a vertex map on your plane. And so what I did was created a second copy of those spherical fields. So let me just come out of this and let's get up close. So we had our trail field. Let's go to this one. So we got our trail field. That's the one that's actually creating the trail itself. But then if you wanted the material to change, then you need that field to also be interacting with the geometry, so the points that you want to affect and change the material of. But because this field is just covering our sphere, it's not really getting close enough to these points to change the color of them. So what I did was create a second spherical field that's a child of that trail field. So I've just moved that one down and made it slightly bigger. So you can see this one is properly interacting with the geometry. So once that's set up, so that means, yeah, if I was to go back into my vertex map, you can see that second spherical field is the one that is activating on our vertex map. So using that information, we can go into our material. So I just set this material up. I was just messing around with stuff really. And you can use this vertex attribute node. And all you need to do is drop in your vertex map into this attribute name, and then you can use that to drive different parts of your animation. So I plugged it into a color mix, which means the parts that are yellow are going to be orange, because so you have to think of it as it's like a range of 0 to 1. So at the moment, before we play anything, all of these points like the red is 0, and then once it turns to yellow, it's a value of 1. So that's how a color mix would also interpret what inputs to output. So an input 1 would be 0, which is blue, which is my original color, and then the values that are yellow that turn to 1 would output input 2, which is orange that I've set here. And then the same thing I just did over here was to create like a bump map, but it does the exact same thing. It's just displaying my bump map that I've created on the original geometry, like just the blue surface, and then once it passes over and turns yellow on the vertex map, it's just I've set it to black, which basically just means nothing. It's just going to be smooth. And then I plug that into a bump map and plug that into here. So with that all set up, you should now have a trail effect working. This should also work. This doesn't need to necessarily be objects pushing through like snow, like I have here almost. Maybe you'd want to attach spherical fields or like box fields to your character's feet if you're doing like a character animation, because when they walk through, like say you've got them walking on sand or snow, they could leave footprints. That would also work. You can use this technique for multiple different things. But anyway, that's it for today's tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to drop a like if you learned something new, and I hope to see you in the next one. Hey.